Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You know, one of the best ways to create animosity and hatred between two people is to spread a lie about a specific person. So if you're someone who's, believable and the people believe you when you speak and you spread a lie about someone, they're going to believe that lie and think that it's true. And when they think that that lie is true, it changes their opinion of that person and makes them think bad about that person. The same thing is true when it comes to different groups of people. And this is what the Salafis, the followers of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and his ideology, this is what they do against the Ash'aris and the Maturidis, who are the two madhabs of Ahlulsunnah, of the Aqeedah of Ahlulsunnah, and have been for the past 1,400 years. Now, part of their ideology is to remove Ash'aris and Maturidis from Ahlus Sunnah and to say that they're deviant and to say that they're misguided and whatnot. So in order to do this, they had to create some lies. Now these lies don't work on the people who are knowledgeable of the actual Aqeedah. These lies work on the people who don't actually know anything, who haven't actually gone to study anything. And this is what the Salafi sect is famous for, that they grab people who are, they don't know much about the religion, but they're enthusiastic and they want to learn about Islam. So they get those people because those are the people who don't know anything and they can teach them. And when they teach them, they're going to teach them with all these lies. So you'll see so many people online will talk about, oh, the Ash'aris believe this, and it's not even true. So anyways, I wanted to talk about some of those lies in this video over here, where one of the leaders of the Salafi sect, Ibn Uthaymeen, is commenting on the Ash'ari Aqeedah and the attributes of Allah. And so one of the lies that they say is that the Ash'aris reject certain attributes of Allah, and the Ash'aris reject from the Qur'an, and they reject certain hadith, and the Ash'aris only take their intellect, and so on. So let's go ahead and get into the book. This is Ibn Uthaymeen's commentary of Al-Aqeedah al-Wasitiyah by Ibn Uthaymeen, and he's talking about the Ash'ari Madhab. He says, the Ash'aris only affirm 7 attributes of Allah. What are these 7? Allah's divine life, Allah's eternal hearing, and His eternal speech, and His eternal sight, and His eternal knowledge, His eternal will, and His eternal power. These are the 7 attributes that he says that the Ash'aris affirm. Now, the problem is when he says that the Ash'aris only affirm these 7, which is where the lie is. The Ash'aris don't only affirm 7 attributes for Allah. In fact, there are so many attributes of Allah that we don't even know, and there are many more attributes than just these 7. Anyhow, he continues on to say, فَهَذِهِ الصِّفَاتُ نُثْبِتُهَا لِأَنَّ الْعَقْلَ دَلَّ عَلَيْهَا. This is the second misunderstanding that he brings, that he says that the Ash'aris affirm these attributes because the intellect proved them, or we got those attributes from the intellect. That's not even true. 3 out of those 4 attributes are not proven from the intellect, and they're actually taken from the Qur'an and the Sunnah, which is Allah's speech, Allah's hearing, and Allah's sight. He says over here, وَبَقِيَّةُ الصِّفَاتِ مَا دَلَّ عَلَيْهَا الْعَقْلِ. That the rest of the attributes, in other words, whatever else comes from the Qur'an and Sunnah, this is what he's saying, right? He's saying that everything else that comes from the Qur'an and Sunnah in terms of the attributes of Allah, مَا دَلَّ عَلَيْهَا الْعَقْلُ. The intellect did not prove those on its own, and so because of that, he's saying that they reject it. That's what he says right after. He says, فَنُثْبِتُ مَا دَلَّ عَلَيْهِ الْعَقْلُ وَنُنْكِرُ مَا لَمْ يَدُلَّ عَلَيْهِ الْعَقْلُ. That he's saying that Ash'aris affirm what the intellect can prove, and they reject what the intellect cannot come up with on its own. Now, notice there's a difference between saying what the intellect rejects and what the intellect cannot come up with. And this is a point that is very commonly misunderstood. That some people say that, the intellect didn't prove that Allah is all-hearing, so we rejected Allah's hearing. No, that's not the case. The intellect didn't prove that, but it also didn't prove the impossibility of that. So it could be, could not be, and because the Qur'an said so, then we believe it. So now, what is the principle of Ahlus-Sunnah wal Jama'ah? What is the principle of the Ash'ari Madhab in Aqeedah? I'm going to tell you the principle. The principle is that we affirm everything that Allah affirmed for Himself in the Qur'an in terms of His attributes. And we affirm everything that the Prophet ﷺ affirmed for Allah in terms of the attributes. And we believe everything that the intellect can affirm about the attributes of Allah as well. Why do we affirm from the intellect? Because the intellect is what leads us to knowing that Islam is truth. Once we know that Islam is truth, then we have to take from the Qur'an and Sunnah, right? So why do we take from the Qur'an and Sunnah? Because we believe Islam is true. So now, whatever the Qur'an says about Allah's attributes, we believe it. Whatever the Sunnah says about Allah's attributes, we believe it, and we don't reject it, and we don't change it, we don't do anything like this, as what the Salafis like to say. They say that the Ash'aris do this, and they change the meanings of the Qur'an, and they reject this. And this is what he says right after. He says, وَهَؤُلَاء هُمُ الْأَشَاعِرَةِ. That these people that he just described, they're the Ash'aris, which is completely a lie and a complete misrepresentation of the Ash'ari Madhab. He says, آمنوا بالبعض وأنكروا البعض. That they believed in some of the attributes of Allah and they rejected some of the attributes of Allah. Now, I want to make one more point, which is that the Ash'ari scholars never rejected an attribute that Allah affirmed for Himself in the Qur'an. Why is it that we say Allah is all hearing and all seeing? Because the Qur'an said so and because the Qur'an said so alone, not because of the intellect. And if you tried to use the intellect to prove that Allah is all hearing, you wouldn't be able to do so. You can't prove that Allah has an attribute or God has an attribute of hearing and of sight using the intellect alone. We believe it because the Qur'an said so. So then the Salafis will come and say, well, Allah said in the Qur'an, بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ, that Allah's hands are outspread. But you don't believe in the attribute of Allah's hands. The answer is not that we reject an attribute that Allah affirmed for Himself, but whether Allah actually affirmed that attribute for Himself or not. Did Allah actually affirm hands for Himself as an attribute, or did He just mean a figure of speech? You know, when Allah says, وَلَا تَبْسُطْهَا كُلَّ الْبَسْطِ, that don't spread your hands as much as they can possibly be spread. And Allah meant by saying that, it's a figure of speech in the Arabic language. When you say that, you actually mean don't be so generous, right? Don't be so generous that you give all of your wealth. Don't give out all of your wealth. That's what spreading your hands out, as much as they can spread. That's what that means. So when Allah uses the exact same wording, talking about His own hands, does it actually just mean, Allah is actually very generous instead? Or does it literally mean that Allah's two hands are outspread? So the scholars differed that, okay, we know that Allah can't have literal body parts, so body parts are rejected for Allah. So they've already rejected the literal meaning of the word hands. They didn't reject that this is taken on its literal in the sense that it's taken as an attribute for Allah. They rejected that this is taken on its literal in the meaning of the word hand, because the meaning of the word hand is a physical body part. That's some scholars. They said, okay, it's an attribute of Allah. And some of the Ash'aris have actually said this, that it is an attribute of Allah, that Allah has an attribute called yad. It's not a physical body part, and Allah knows best about its reality. This is what some of the Ash'ari scholars said. Other scholars differed and said, no, this is just a figure of speech. Because the Arabs used to say, don't spread your hands all the way out. And they didn't mean anything to do with hands. Hands had no importance in that statement. That statement only meant, don't give all of your wealth. So when Allah says His hands are outspread, it just means Allah is very generous and He gives as He wills. And this is what Allah Himself actually says right after, where He says, بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ يُنْفِقُ كَيْفَ يَشَاءُ, that Allah gives as He wills. Right? It doesn't mean Allah is literally giving with His hands. That's not what it means. It means Allah is very generous and Allah gives as He wills. Allah gives as He wills. So this is what the debate is actually about. That it's not about whether we accept the attributes or not from the Qur'an and Sunnah. If there's an attribute that's established for Allah in the Qur'an and Sunnah, we accept it. The question is whether that is actually an attribute or not. And so some of the scholars, as I just explained, some of them said that no, this is not actually an attribute. It's, because a hand is a body part. Body parts are not attributes. Body parts are not an attribute of a person, right? The attributes are like your sight. The body part is the eye. The attribute is hearing. The body part is the ear. So when we say a hand, the attribute would be power to do something. The hand is the tool by which humans do that thing. But we say that Allah is not physical. Allah does not have these types of tools. Allah doesn't have eyes. He doesn't have ears. He doesn't have hands, these types of body parts, etc. So now that point is understood, it's not about rejecting an attribute from the Qur'an and Sunnah. It's actually about whether this attribute was actually established from the Qur'an and Sunnah or not. And as for what Allah has explicitly established when He says, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ, that Allah is all hearing and all seeing. When Allah explicitly establishes this, then we accept it and we don't change any meanings of it and we take it on its literal as an attribute of Allah. But when it's not explicit, there's a difference of opinion. Just as scholars differed on the meanings of other verses, such as when Allah said, "Oh, lamastumun nisa," when you touch women. And the Shafi'i scholars said that means a literal touch. And the Hanafi scholars said, no, that actually means intercourse. So there's different meanings that the Arabic language can give off, and the scholars differed. It doesn't mean that any of them are deviants and any of them are outside of the fold of Ahlulsunnah because of it. So when you hear people say that the Ash'aris only affirm 7 attributes of Allah, reject it and don't listen to it. When you hear that the Salafis are saying that the Ash'aris reject attributes of Allah from the Qur'an, don't listen to it. When you hear that the Ash'aris reject attributes that are not proven by the intellect alone, don't listen to it. These are some of the lies that are spread against the Ash'aris in terms of Aqeedah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.